USC and UCLA look like they are leaving the Pac-12 for the Big Ten as early as 2024. Could Oregon follow? Let's discuss. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is time for an emergency episode of Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. As always, you know all that stuff. I'm joined by Rian Winter at SportsChat503 is the handle. And you can tell this is an emergency pod because he is at the beautiful, majestic Oregon coast, wind blowing in the background. The American flag is there. His connection is hopefully just good enough to hold on because we've just, I couldn't hold off. We couldn't wait until tomorrow. We couldn't wait until you were in a different place. We had to go, Ryan. Let's just hop right into it. USC and UCLA are leaving the Pac-12. Your initial takeaways when you heard the news just a couple hours ago?
You know, I hate to say I was not surprised because I kind of felt that this was happening, right? There was major shifts going down when Pac-12 wanted Oklahoma and Texas originally. They didn't get it. I felt like that could have been the death nail right there. Oklahoma and Texas go to SEC. So you know nothing's safe. I think conference realignment is as fluid as anything else in our society at this moment. Insert whatever you want to call there. This idea, what we have right now is literally could be the end of the Pac-12 right in front of our face at a time when we thought the Pac-12 wasn't that far off from the rest of the conferences. It just looks like everything's very shaky. The Big 12 almost died. They were able to rebuild it. Maybe is not at what they thought they had before, or maybe at the same level, but the Pac-12 is in a similar situation. The real question is, Spencer, now, does Oregon try to bolt and go, and or do they try to be the showcase of this West Coast Conference, that whatever it's going to be?
I think it's such a fascinating time for Oregon to have this happen because we just hired a new head coach. You got a brand new staff. You talk about throwing a curveball or throwing a wrench into their plans and whatnot. You don't have to factor that into the recruiting trail because USC, UCLA are leaving. I'm sure you're going to have recruits asking Oregon coaches, are you guys leaving the Pac-12? Are you going to go to the Big Ten? And let's also make something very clear, at least at this point in time, because I can't think of another reason. Maybe you can, Ryan. USC and UCLA are doing this for the dollars. Like there's nothing else there. There is no football reason. Also, the fact that American flag is just blown in the back of your shot is just the best guest appearance you've probably ever had on the show, and that's saying something, man. But anyway, so there's no other logical reason to do it other than the Big Ten is going to pay them probably $15, $20 million more per year. And I understand college athletics are a big business. You go to any athletic director, you go to any administrator and say, would your athletics department like to have another $15 to $20 million a year? The answer is going to be, yeah, where do I sign? And what do I have to do? It doesn't matter. So there's a significant gap there. And I kind of thought of it from one point of view earlier of this kind of feels like the poor groundwork laid by Larry Scott. The chickens are coming home to roost here because you have two schools that are leaving because, and then there's no football logic there. It's a tougher path to the playoff. It makes no geographical sense unless you can get a couple other Pac-12 schools to go with you. Maybe Oregon. We'll get to that here in a little bit, but you are looking at, a conference that is not paying as much to each school from the conference because the TV deals we know were terrible. I mean, the Pac-12 network's not on direct TV. You lost so much money there, and everybody knows. And Pac-12 After Dark, yeah, it's a fun, cool, branded thing. But guess what? Nobody in the East Coast is watching. So you're getting lower ratings. That's less money coming in. Like, there's a whole litany of issues that have existed for years that people have griped about within the Pac-12 conference. And this kind of feels like the culmination of it and just kind of the punishment that we as Pac-12 fans are getting for having that been the case for the last several years.
I would agree with that. And, I kind of liken it to what we saw locally with the Blazers. Remember when we had the issue with the Blazer vision, right? And we had all these people inside the Blazer market that were not getting the Blazer game. Remember this? This was late 90s, Paul Allen. They kind of changed the game on how their TV rights were kind of, established to the point where, just a couple years ago, they don't even host any games at all on KGW at all anymore. There's no more Blazer games on local television at all. Zero. And you saw this when you saw the move to the Rose Bowl on ESPN, the national championship game, that first one against Auburn, first one not nationally televised on standard television. It's on cable. So there was a bunch of moves that you could see this happening with. The Larry Scott thing completely fumbled the bag. Larry Scott's deal, this thing really affected the LA area. There was a humongous amount of LA, whether it's at USC or UCLA, alumni, fan base, whatever the case, that were shut out of seeing their own teams in their own city on their own television. In an era where people are not going to live games as much, you have so much access, everybody's on TV all the time, and here you are in Los Angeles and you can't even watch the USC game. I mean, talk about a travesty. And, Larry Scott came in promising the world, and he obviously under-delivered on those promises. And this is a big time chickens come into roost. This is a great example where this is a situation where you could have stopped this. Even bigger, you could have been ahead of the whole thing. And I do think that Pac-12 did see this coming. That's why they made such a huge play for the Oklahoma-Texas move originally. And, I started talking about that to begin with because I think that's where it all starts with the West Coast here. We knew it was on a fine line. You knew you had to hit a big home run with those teams. And you went with Colorado and Utah, which, again, have maybe helped the programs here and there out, but they were promised a huge deal as well and never got it. And Colorado was in a situation where now what are they going to do? Go back? So, the whole conference looks like it's going to get broken up. It looks like teams are going to go back to maybe a Big 12 situation. Arizona might be a Big 12 situation. You might have the whole thing broken up. And you left with the only conference on the West Coast being the WCC with Gonzaga and Pepperdine. I mean, it's a wild situation we're in right now.
Yeah, and you can't forget the Mountain West when talking about West Coast conferences
but I'm
as well.
I'm talking about true West Coast culture. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, Mountain West has entered into the West Coast, but we're talking about one of the historical conferences of the entire country. The original Pac-8 is a very historic conference. And to break this thing up over chasing the money that's going to be guaranteed, as they say, Larry Scott guaranteed the money too. And I just see it happening. And the way it looks for me is, we can talk about this again. We're going here a long time, but I like it from a perspective of how does it impact football? How does it impact the rest of the athletic department? Because that to me is a huge question here. And I think they're chasing the money on the football side, and they're not really looking at the rest of the athletic department the same way.
Well, I think that's just the way college sports operate in general. You think about football first and foremost, and that's it. You think about football first, second, and third. Like someone asked me one time, when she asked, when she learned that I hosted the show, she's like, so, like, what do you talk about? What topics do you go with? I'm like, well, football is first, football is second, football is third, men's basketball is fourth, football is fifth, and women's basketball is sixth. Like, that's the way that people care about this stuff. That's the way you have to think about it. And that's the way, because if you're thinking about from an athletics revenue standpoint, athletics are described at the collegiate level as the front porch for a university. Well, if that's true, then the front doormat, the first thing that you see before you walk into that house, is your football program. And that's why I think you see these considerations come into play for football and just not factor in the other ones, because most of them are non-revenue. Even a lot of basketball programs, even a lot of men's basketball programs are non-revenue. Yeah, right. Like people would be shocked if they looked it up to learn how few sports teams at the collegiate level make money and how much money football actually brings in. So that's why they're putting that, at the forefront there. But, the reason that I just find it so puzzling, and that it's such a money play, especially for USC, is what's been stopping USC from getting in the college football playoff? Is it money? Are they short on cash? Because I'm going to go with no on USC short on cash. The answer is no. But I am not a hyperbolic person. I actually get very annoyed by people who are hyperbolic. And what you said earlier, Ryan, I do agree with. I don't think this is it's ridiculous to say that in 5 or 6 years or so, we could look back and say this was the moment that the Pac-12 started to just disappear. The reason I say that is because the geographical location of the LA schools going to, or the whole situation of the LA schools going to the Big Ten doesn't make a ton of sense. And one thing I've heard from some people in the Oregon space, and I think they might be right, is it makes more sense if you could get a pod of schools to go. So if the Big Ten is then going to reach out to, say, Oregon and Washington or Oregon and Utah, try to recruit them as well. And by the way, worth noting, USC and UCLA approached the Big Ten about this move. That's how bad the Pac-12 has been, at least in their view, over the last several years, which is just a horrible, horrible look for the conference overall. But if the Big Ten wants to capitalize this, go to Oregon and Washington or Oregon and Utah and say, hey, do you want to come as well? Then you have 4 schools, and then you could have all those schools playing each other, and you wouldn't have as many long travels or long journeys for teams to travel, because that's a very real thing, and it's going to weigh on teams eventually. Like, it's a hard thing to do, to travel, even in the Pac-12 and whatnot, and it's not that far. But going to the Big Ten, it doesn't make as much sense. But if you then have 2 more teams leave the Pac-12, and one of them is Oregon, I don't know how the Pac-12 would survive that.
The Pac-12 is done. There's no way out. I mean, you lose the 2 schools in Los Angeles. I mean, that's the
huge.
biggest market in the entire conference. It's literally the Mecca on the West Coast, right? And you know what? You're probably going to look at this from a different perspective, because, we have to look at it through the lens of, what do these schools offer? I don't know, outside of Los Angeles schools, if any Pac-12 school offers much to the Big 12 or the Big 10, even Oregon and Washington. And again, I value Oregon because we're from Oregon. We both value it. I think Seattle's amazing, and what Washington is amazing, that what they have to offer. If you could somehow get Oregon and Washington to come to the Big Ten as well, and have it just be Oregon and Washington and the LA schools, you've killed the Pac-12. If I was Stanford, I would go independent tomorrow and just go your own route, play your own schools, do BYU and Notre Dame route, and Cal, is in a weird situation there. Cal, it feels like in the last discussion with the Pac-12 when we went to the divisions, that Cal and Stanford felt like they needed the LA schools to survive, and they needed them to be in their same conference or in their same division and play them every year as a guarantee. Now they're done. Their dancing partners just left. And the amount of fan support that you have in the Bay Area is not that much. And so you could literally be looking at a situation where Cal could be playing the mighty Cal Berkeley Bears could literally be playing in the West Coast Conference. They could be playing Pepperdine. I mean, you could shift things dramatically going forward. And, this also is the conversation we had before where, I basically look at it through the lens of, this should be a football-related issue and the rest of the athletic department issue. I tend to think that Division I college football should completely go away from the NCAA and completely have their own situation where they have their own commissioner, they have their own rules, they have their own deal, because they're impacting right now the rest of the whole college landscape so much more than they ever had before. The conference realignment is basically transfer portal for schools. And you've opened the thing up, transfer portal and NIL. You got these kids who commit on one day, try to get the bag on one day. Somebody offers them a bag on Tuesday. They're going to go to the next one. They're going to flip back and forth. I mean, this is a danger zone for not only college athletics, but for the West Coast. This could be the end of the whole thing from what we know of it.
It's certainly a ground shaker. That, like, there's no way around that. There's no way to understand, like, oh, it's just a couple teams leaving. No. It would be just a couple teams leaving. Heck, if it was just Cal and Stanford who left, or if it was even though they just won the Pac-12, very nearly won the Rose Bowl, if Utah and Colorado decided to leave, or if the Arizona, it'd be one thing. But it was the UCLA and USC combo. Like, that is so massive. And so, and one thing, I understand what you're saying about, football maybe branching off. I get that, but it's not viable, because football is the reason that the NCAA has the other sports to run. So you can't separate them.
No, it's not. But I'm just saying, like, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, did I imagine this happening? I would have said no. Now I'm looking in the next 10 years thinking anything's possible. Aliens could land between now and then. The government already said they're out there, so I don't even know at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know that much anymore. But so,
But you're right.
let,
The magnitude of the LA schools is much more
yes,
significant than any
yes,
other school in the entire conference. By far. No
especially
matter where their stance is right now in their college football or basketball. No, just the magnitude of those schools geographically is massive. Next thing is they're going to be going to Rutgers for some women's basketball games. You're going to be going.
That's a
across
lot
the
of.
country.
That's just a lot, man. That's oh man, that
go to Maryland. You're going to be going up. You're playing Maryland. Maryland,
I
who
just
used
have
to be in the ACC, is now going to be playing against teams that used to be in the Pac-12 or Pac-10. That's mind blowing.
that is great. Just for a regular conference game,
Just for a regular game now.
You have to go to the Eastern time zone. You have to fly all the way across the country. I mean, that sounds. Oh my gosh, yeah. I hadn't even gotten to that part of it entirely because I'm thinking.
And again, that speaks to the level of it's not that college football is so different than everything else. It's just that the value of it has gone up so much. The value of the other sports has not gone up like it has for college football.
No, college football has taken
exponentially grown over the years to be this magnitude of what it is now. It was a shell of itself 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken off in a major way because this is the United States. You got the American flag flying behind you and everything. This is America, Ryan. We love our football. That is what we watch. It is the NFL number 1 and college football number 2, and then everything else is below, professional or college. We watch March Madness, sure, but we watch college football a whole heck of a lot more. I mean, even Oregon, the amount of revenue that football brings in compared to men's basketball, they're in different stratospheres of revenue that's coming. I think men's basketball barely turns a very minor profit, and football brings in enough to pay for all of the other sport. It's so massive now, and you've got donors involved as well. It's a really, really big thing.
Well, and that college basketball number is probably coming off of the time when Oregon was in the Final Four. Right?
Yeah,
so best of the very best, the very best it's ever had, it's barely breaking even at this point. Yeah.
Yep, that's the way it's at. So let's tie this back to Oregon a little bit. Do you think that now they almost have to leave the conference? Is there a viable path to Oregon staying in the Pac-12 where they can contend for college football playoff spots and hopefully once again with Dan Lanning and company a national championship? Can you do that in a Pac-10 that doesn't have? I mean, maybe they would add some Mountain West schools, a Boise, a Utah State, San Diego State, whatever, nice programs or whatever, but nowhere near the caliber that not just USC and UCLA, but a potentially resurgent USC. Think about how much of a gut punch that is for George Kliavkoff, the new commissioner of the Pac-12. You come in, Lincoln Riley gets hired by USC. The one thing that Larry Scott did not have control over was the Trojans hiring the right coach to be the sort of football program that they are capable of being. Then they come in, they hire this guy, and all the talk this offseason about the Pac-12 is USC going to compete? Lincoln Riley, how fast can he make them really, really good? When are they going to make the playoff? The Pac-12 is back. This is huge for the conference, and now they're just bolting after 2 years. I mean, that is so brutal for the conference. So does Oregon, do we have to look at looking or do we have, I don't know why I keep saying the word look, but do we have to look at going to another conference? Is it just inevitable at this point?
I mean, it's the classic risk reward, right? I mean, you and I both love golf, and it's that classic question, right? Do I go for it? Do I go for the home run ball, knowing that I can put it on the green from here? Or am I just going to try to go with the safe bet and try to go for an up and down and save par? And you're either basically looking at, am I trying to save par and keep the conference alive and be the flagship of this new conference, be Oregon and Washington leading the Northwest and keeping
Utah,
keeping the Beavs, keeping the Cougs, keeping all that together, trying to keep as much of that Pac-12 North together, keep Stanford, keep Cal, try to do everything we can. And like you're saying, they do not want to add any other school outside of the AAU. I get it. They're very much on the academic prowess level. But academically, Oregon is really not even at the level that the Big Ten is at anyway. So the Big Ten
Oh.
could look at Oregon and say, hey, buddy, we don't even really want you. Your grades aren't good enough. Now, Washington, with their academic prowess, they're there. They're on the level. They're on the same level as those guys over there. And they make a big deal about that. Now, again, with USC and UCLA, you've got two of the best schools in the country. I mean, UCLA consistently rates as one of the best public schools in the country, and USC is a dominant school.
Yep.
And what they provide in Los Angeles specifically, I mean, they went after the Rutgers, base, for television media market. They're going to get LA. I mean, come on. So Oregon's in a position where it's risk reward. Do they try to tail along, and do they ask like these other guys asked to try to join that team? I don't know. I tend to think that there's two very big differences between the schools of thought here. Almost kind of like do we hire the safe coach versus go for the big splashy hire, right? And do you really think that Oregon has enough cachet to carry their weight in this new conference, that we'd be wanted enough? Or are you kind of stuck in this mindset of the past where Oregon really wasn't relevant nationally and really wasn't on that level? And I think there's a lot of fan bases who are kind of in agreement with where they're at. I don't think Oregon fan base is. I think there's very split. And we saw that with the coaching hire. That you saw a bunch of fans say, hey, pump the brakes. Hire the guy locally. Let's, and other people were like, screw that. We need to win a championship. Let's go Bill Belichick. I mean, the ideology is that you're kind of in this mindset. Who's running the operation, though? Rob Mullins. Now, Rob Mullins said, go back years now at the Duck functions that I go to, Portland Duck Club, that our competition is not necessarily Washington State, Oregon State, Washington. It's more U of M, Ohio State, Bama, Texas, Oklahoma. And when he made that statement, I kind of felt the air change a little bit, because there was a bunch of old timers in that room. I mean, anytime you're in one of those Duck Club of Portland kind of events, there's a lot of old timers there, right? A lot of old donors who were like, wait a minute. I don't know if we're necessarily the same national brand that the young people think we are, right? So I think Oregon's in a tough spot. I don't think that they really have a choice. I don't think the Big Ten necessarily wants Oregon. I mean, coming from a perspective, obviously we love the Ducks, but I don't know if they love the Ducks.
Well, I think academically you might have a point there, but from a football perspective, why wouldn't you want Oregon if you're the Big Ten? I mean,
I think the whole athletic department's strong at Oregon. I think you bring a lot to the table with Oregon, but
but I mean we all know football.
But it's sharing the pie with two more teams, and unless you're mandated to have a certain number, if they were to pick 4 schools from the Pac-12, I think Oregon would be on the list. But if they're only going to pick 2 schools from the Pac-12, Oregon's not on the list.
Well, clearly the Big Ten didn't make it, so that's not clearly the case about who they would choose per se. But
it's still fluid.
Yeah, but if Oregon and Washington or Oregon and Utah do end up becoming, seriously mentioned in conversations with the Big Ten, just look at it from a football perspective, because that's what is, primarily driving this. Like I know that I said earlier, and I still stand by that, this is a financial decision first and foremost. It's a financial decision that comes from football, because that's where that's where all the money is coming from there. But I'm saying from a football perspective, it doesn't make sense in terms of like how you're competing and who you're gonna have to recruit against, who you're gonna have to play each year. I don't think it's that logical for USC and UCLA. But for Oregon, if they go to the Big Ten, like, you're strengthening the conference's brand. I think Oregon, I'll disagree with some of the old heads here. Oregon has enough national respect and pedigree. I mean, they've played in 2 national championship games, to the point where if they go into a conference like the Big Ten, which also has not won a national championship since Ohio State. Since Ohio State. So not in a very long time. What was I thinking? The Big 12 is who I was thinking of. So the Big 12 is in that camp, but they're now losing Texas and Oklahoma, kind of their best chance to do that, and they haven't won one, I don't think, since Texas in 2005 against USC. But I think Oregon has enough respect and pedigree on the national level to be able to come in, and people view the Big Ten as an even bigger brand. Like Lincoln Riley with USC, of course, that adds another big team into the mix, and they're going to play. I mean, think about the gauntlet of games you're going to have to go through. I mean, if it stays with a 4-team college football playoff, you could see a 2-loss Big Ten team get in if USC and Lincoln, right? Like if Chip is able to be an 8-9 win team a year in the Big Ten, which I think he's capable of, then that's, another team that's in the mix. I think they could be like a Wisconsin or a Minnesota or like a Purdue this past year. I think they could be that sort of team. But you put Lincoln Riley at USC into that Big Ten, that is a gauntlet you have to go through. If you get rid of divisions, which everybody's doing, you've got Penn State, you've got Ohio State, you've got Michigan, you would then have USC. You'd have whom I feel like I'm forgetting somebody. Michigan State now with Mel Tucker.
Iowa's been good lately. I mean,
Iowa's been good with Kirk Ferentz. Row the boat. Row the boat with PJ Fleck in Minnesota. Like, there are so many teams there.
It's been the second best football conference outside of the
Easily.
SEC, and the SEC is just so far and above, so dominant. I mean, how many players did Georgia send to the NFL?
15.
Okay, so for 15 guys on a team that plays 60, I mean, the Big Ten is super quality football, but historically, like I'm saying, I think that every NFL or college football is so regional, where NFL is always national, right? So you can have your New York Giants fans in LA or San Francisco. It's very it's regionally based as well. Obviously, there's fan bases are in those major cities, but you're going to find those fans everywhere. Well, that's kind of how college football has gone a little bit, We both share love for Colin Cowherd, and I was buddies with Colin Cowherd when he was in Portland. I would check in with him all the time, like grocery store I worked at, whatever. And that was his play then. He was college football is becoming more national. This was, right around 2000, 2003, 2002. And it says it's going to make it more challenging for you to be successful in your region because you're competing against everybody else in the whole country. And sure enough, basically what he was saying then 20 years ago is now coming full circle today with this. And I think everything is going to be fine. I still think you'll play football, you win games, you get yourself in the best position possible, and you find yourself there at the end. If they're going to expand the playoff anyway, that's going to happen. So it's like, I'm assuming you're probably going to end up with, they're going to shrink the thing down to maybe having 4 conferences. And if you were able to stay out here and you're able to kind of rebuild this conference the way that the Big Ten or the Big 12 rebuilt their conference, Oklahoma State is pretty stoked being in their new league, I think. I think they're playing Houston and Cincinnati,
Yeah.
I think, and not to say that they're better off. They're not. But they're still got a seat at the table, and they have an easier path where now you've got the SEC and the Big Ten. It's a freaking gauntlet. And now Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC, they're not going to be that much better going to the SEC either. I mean, I think they're both going to struggle. I think Oklahoma is going to really feel the pain going to the SEC. I know.
Oh, I think Texas. I think Texas with Sark is going to feel it even worse. Like we've seen Sark as a head coach.
Texas has felt the losses the last couple of years. Their brand is down a little bit. Oklahoma hasn't really lost that much at all the last couple of fights. They're gonna get served quickly. And you're right that with adding more teams to these conferences makes it the gauntlet harder. You're gonna have more teams with more losses there at the end. You're gonna still have teams that are gonna go undefeated in whatever league they play in, bitch and complain because you're gonna have these guys who are gonna have 2 losses going into the national championship.
Yeah, and I think that's the case for Oregon to stay in the Pac-12. But we know finances are driving this, and without the LA market there, the Pac-12 is already, of the Power 5, the 4th lowest in terms of how much the conference distributes to each of their teams at the end of the year. I think in 2022 is around $34 million, and the Big Ten is around like $50 million. So there's a lot of money in play there, and I just wonder if that's going to come into Oregon's calculation. Like, we're already getting less than most of the other teams we're trying to recruit with nationally. And Oregon is very clearly trying to recruit nationally, as I've been talking about here on the show, and I'm sure you've been following as well. Like, they're going after big-time national recruits where, Alabama's after Jaden Wayne, Ohio State's after him, USC, Ohio State, and Alabama, and Georgia, all want Mateo Uiagalelei, or one of those is not in the mix. But anyway, you understand the point that I'm making there. So I wonder if at some point Oregon will look at it and go, look, we could stay in what would then become the Pac-10. Maybe they'd add a couple Mountain West teams to keep it as the Pac-12. I could see that being viable. Boise, San Diego State, Utah State, Fresno State, like that. Those could all be options and whatnot. But then Oregon has to think about, well, is that going to be a viable option to get us to the playoff, right? Is it going to be such a weak conference that it's almost like Cincinnati in the American, where we have to go undefeated in order to get in conference? But like, are we not going to be allowed any margin for error there because you've lost the LA schools on your schedule? But you have to compare that. This is why it's such a tough dilemma for Rob Mullins and the administration to be in right now. You have to compare that with, would I rather go through a gauntlet that I know if I can get through, I'll get into the playoff? Or would I rather be in a conference that's going to eventually, it seems, bring in less money than it is now, which is already not as much as we would like it to be, and have an easier football conference slate that could allow you to get into the college football playoff as well? Because that's why, from a football point of view, I don't think this makes a lot of sense for USC or UCLA. UCLA, they're trying to win a conference championship and get to a New Year's Six bowl. Like, that's their top goal right now, to try to make themselves a credible, consistent player on the national stage. USC, they're trying to get to a college football playoff. Where is that easier to do right now? In the Pac-12 compared to the Big Ten. It's way easier in the Pac-12 because you have such an easier path forward. But when USC and UCLA are there, the Pac-12, though it doesn't have a ton of respect nationally, still has enough. It still has enough to where if you put together a team and have the sort of season that is playoff caliber and you win the conference championship, you will get into that playoff. We've seen it happen before with Oregon and Washington, but now I think with UCLA and USC out, if it reverts back to being the Pac-10, you have a very legitimate question of, if we are a really good team and we have a really great season in the Pac-10, is that going to be enough without, say, a major non-conference win like an Oregon over Ohio State, or, we're all hoping and praying, of course, Oregon over Georgia and such, but is that going to be the requirement now? Because I talked about that with Oregon and USC on this show a couple months ago about how, like, look, USC being back with Lincoln Riley is not all bad news for the Ducks, because right now, because the Pac-12 is so weak, the path to the playoff has to include a big-time non-conference schedule win. And those games are hard to find because college football scheduling is so messed up in so many ways. And they're also hard to win because you're playing good teams. We beat Ohio State this year, but guess what? We lost Auburn in 2019. We lost LSU in 2011. That sort of stuff is not easy to find. And so now, if you were to look at it, the Pac-10 with Washington is rebuilding, right? I think they have the potential. I talked about this on Locked On Pac-12 the other day. You can go check it out for my full thoughts if you want, but I think Washington has a greater ability to become a quote-unquote national brand than Utah does, even given the current state of their programs, because Washington has been to the playoffs, so they have that sort of respect and credibility and pedigree as a football program overall. But if you're looking at it from Oregon's perspective, I mean, it looks like it's just going to be Oregon, Utah, and the Muppets going forward if you don't have UCLA and USC. I mean, UCLA this year, I think, is a dark horse to win the Pac-12 Conference. And USC is certainly going to be a contender in the Pac-12 South. And then Utah's there, and that already is not an incredibly strong lineup of teams. And if you weaken that even further, taking out the LA schools, I mean, I just wonder how the conference is going to be viewed by the College Football Playoff Committee and by voters and writers nationally, of like, oh yeah, they went 8-2 in conference play. That's great, but they were in the Pac-10, which is like how good is that really?
Yeah, I still think that you have to win out to get there. I just even in the current landscape, like this year, I think if the Ducks want to be in the college football playoff, I think they have to go undefeated. I think that they could beat Georgia
in conference play.
Yeah, I think even you got to beat Georgia. I still think that the college football landscape is so jaded against the West Coast. There's just such a humongous slant in the other direction. This year, let's say the Ducks go and SC is great and they meet in the Pac-12 championship game. you're right. That's the game that would seal the deal for Oregon getting into the college football playoff. Maybe even with a loss against Georgia if they play the rest of the year really dominant football. And Georgia's got to be great, too. They got to be undefeated or whatever. But the idea is it's just the cards are stacked against anybody on the West Coast. Even if it was USC with all their hype and cachet, if they were to go maybe lose a game to ASU, and that would be counted against them so much harder than anybody else's loss would be counted against theirs. I think that it's a slanted situation, which pushes the envelope even more toward moving to a new conference and devolving this conference to nothing, because this conference is literally hanging on by a thread. The same conference that Bill Walton calls the Conference of Champions, the same conference that is in the record of all the team sport champions for national champions, is in real jeopardy because of football and because of the whole push for football. I think basketball-wise as well, they haven't been relevant in basketball since the Kevin Love, Russell Westbrook, UCLA era, right? You haven't won a national championship since the Arizona years, right? So, or maybe it was UCLA or Arizona. I think it was Arizona in 97 or whatever. But you haven't won a football championship since Reggie Bush. And so basically you're 20 years out from being a champion in the two most relevant sports. You can win lacrosse, you can win college athletic, you can win golf. We both love golf, but you can win golf with women's, basketball tournament last year was two Pac-12 schools, Arizona and Stanford, for women's basketball. You can be dominant in softball. They're great in softball. There are all these other sports they're great in, but
doesn't matter.
Not competitive on the national stage in football and basketball. At the very end, they're good. They've got good teams out here. They can compete. But at the end of the day, they're not having the champagne poured over their head or the confetti coming down. And that hurts their cachet year after year after year. I do think if Oregon had beat Auburn, things would have been different for a little while. But it's just it didn't happen. And there's luck's gone against Oregon. And then when Oregon does beat Ohio State, they fumble the bag at the end of the year, and their team looks like a disappointment on probably the biggest win non-conference wise they've ever had. So it's just one of those things where you're such a fine line that you're walking. I mean, there's just no room for error. And I think the conference feels the heat from that. They moved to the no divisions thing to try to, accommodate the rest of the country, because that's what they're doing. And I think it works out better in their favor to get the two best teams in there. But, you're also giving up the regions. You're also giving up the divisions. There's all sorts of different stuff there. So they've got their hands full. And I know that office right now is scrambling, and they're just hoping and praying that there's not another shoe that falls and that it's only these two. Because my first thought was that's what it's going to be. My very first thought was these two teams are going to leave, and the Pac-10 is going to be the Pac-10 again. They're going to divide the pie up with two less teams. Yes, they're getting less out of it because they lose the LA schools, but they're going to consolidate their pie a little bit. And they're going to just run it back because the Pac-12 is such a freaking stupid conference anyway at the highest ends. Hopefully Kliakov has cleared some of that up. But with the Larry Scott era, they just feel like they're flat-footed and they don't know what they should be doing. And they don't have the right decision makers on board. And so now we're in a situation where you basically have schools jumping like players jump in the transfer portal. And now you got to have a whole thing rally it together. I mean, what happens if Oregon and Washington leave? Where the hell does Oregon State go? I mean,
the Mountain West. I get. I mean, it's a legitimate
West
question.
the
I
biggest
think.
conference out here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And what I was talking about earlier, and why I don't think it's insanely hyperbolic to ponder whether or not this could be the beginning of the end for the Pac-12 conference as a whole, because if USC, UCLA looks like they're officially gone. I saw a tweet from, I think it was, who was it? Thamel? Peter Thamel, I think is his name. Somebody like that. But anyway, legitimate college football guy who's covering the sport said that within the next 24 hours, there's expected to be a press conference to make this official. So we're not really speculating as much anymore. It's not, signed on the dotted line, but it looks like that this is what's going to happen. And so if that is the case, and you have USC and UCLA gone, if Oregon and Washington then go, there's nobody left. There's nobody left in the conference to bring in revenue, right? To bring attention, to bring hype, to bring national relevance. Aside from Utah, I mean, it's just not going to be. It wouldn't be considered a Power Five conference anymore. There's no way. If Oregon and Washington were to leave, the Pac-12 would cease to be a Power Five conference, because how in the world could it be? You'd have Utah, and then who's the next best team? Oregon State, no disrespect to the Beavs, but they were 1-11 in 2017 and one of the worst football teams I've ever seen live in person at the collegiate level. Like, that's just not going to be enough. And so you would either, I think you would see a merger potentially. Maybe Colorado and Utah would break off and go, to the Big 12 or something. But I think that the long-term potential here is a merger between the Pac-12 and the Mountain West, because there's geographical similarities there, and you just have you have no other options at that point, because you can't look at a conference like the WCC that doesn't have football and say, like, oh, where are we going to merge there? Like, no, you have to have football driving the bus here, because that's how college athletics work, because that's what we care about most, that's what we talk about most, and that's what we pay the most money for. Like, that's the way that it is. But Ryan, I think I've taken you away from your family vacation for
Yeah,
for
you're
long
good,
enough.
man. Yeah, you're good, man. I'm out here just this is what we do in the summertime,
I mean, there are a few better places to be once it stops raining than the Pacific Northwest.
Well,
I mean, it's.
I totally agree. And this conversation's just getting started, buddy. So
Yeah,
we'll
we're not.
have
We're not.
plenty of time.
Yeah, we're not there. We didn't even prep for this. We just went. We just said, let's go. Let's just get it
That's how we
out.
go, though, man. You gotta stay ready. You don't gotta get ready. Let's do
Yeah,
it.
that's exactly right. This has been an emergency episode of Locked On Ducks. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Rian Winter is his name. At SportsChat503 is his name on YouTube and on Twitter. We bring him on all the time, and we'll continue to do so. And as he said, Ryan, these conversations just getting started. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Appreciate you, man. Happy summer.
Everybody, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.